when I was about 6 years old, I was visiting my grandparents' house in Janesville, Wisconsin, and I remember clearly sitting at their kitchen table, and I decided to write a poem. And my mom still has that poem in some scrapbook somewhere. And from that day, my love of poetry began. Earlier this week, or actually last week, I was at McNally Bookstore on Prince Street in Soho, and I was looking for a fresh new voice, someone contemporary who is speaking from the posture of a poet, from the posture of a seer, who can see the varied layers and textures of humanity. And I came across a young woman named Rupi Kaur. She's currently 25 years old. She's published 2 books of poetry. One is called Milk and Honey, that's her first book. And she is a Punjabi Sikh. And she left India with her mother around the age of 3 in the early 90s. Her father left a few years earlier because many of the Sikh men in the late 80s were suffering from a tyrannical regime. There was a genocide, you might say, and many Sikh men were being martyred, were being executed, merely for their faith, but also for their political stances. And so she wrote these books. She's a bit of an Instagram poet, you might say, because a lot of her poetry, they're very concise, sometimes only 3 or 4 or 7 verses, and she has 3 million followers on Instagram. She's huge there. She's a New York Times bestseller. And so I devoured this book, Milk and Honey, and I found myself a couple days later looking for another fresh voice who would stir my soul the way that this poet did. And I'm looking and I'm reading different poets, and I came across Arthur Rimbaud, the 19th century French poet who I discovered when I was about 15 years old. And I opened it up and I'm like, this is so fresh and so alive. And yet it was written nearly 150 years ago. I didn't buy it. I went home and I got out my own copy of Rimbaud's poetry. And in it there's a brief portion of a letter that Rimbaud wrote to his mentor at the age of 16. And he writes this: I want to be a poet, and I'm working and turning myself into a seer. You won't understand any of this, and I'm almost incapable of explaining it to you. The idea is to reach the unknown by the derangement of all the senses. It involves enormous suffering. But one must be strong and be born a poet. It's really not my fault. And this portion of the letter is complete. Rimbaud stopped writing poetry at the age of 19. He left France and he went to North Africa. He went to Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. He was in Uganda. He got caught up in all sorts of troublesome work, gun running, slave trading, like horrible things, all within the continent. He wasn't transferring off the continent, but working within that economy. He had suffered greatly in his life. Some of the suffering he brought upon himself. But I really want to talk about another poet and another visionary, a mystic, from 1,000 years ago. And her name is Hildegard. And she's from Germany. She's called Hildegard of Bingen, or Sibyl of the Rhine. At the age of 4, she was a sickly child. All sorts of physical ailments had racked her body. And at those times, they didn't have a network of hospitals and hospices like we have today. So her parents, who were what you would call something along the lines of free low nobility. They were nobility, they were free people, but they weren't the wealthiest. They were like upper middle class, maybe? I'm reaching a little bit. Something along those lines. And so they took their little Hildegard and they took her to a convent. And they said, will you care for our sickly child? But it wasn't only because she was sickly. This little girl, starting at the age of 3, began to have visions and celestial revelations and mystical encounters with orders of angels and other such things. Today in the 21st century, they might say, well, let's give this child this pill or that pill and get some counseling. But in those days, they believed that something must be happening with this child to be sharing such visions. So Hildegard, she grew up in the convent, and by the age of 18, she took orders or vows, and she became a nun. And she thrived in this atmosphere. She was what you'd call a polymath. She was brilliant at just about everything she tried. She was a writer, a composer, a philosopher, mystic, and visionary. And she's also considered to be the founder of scientific natural history in Germany. She was a botanist, a brilliant person. But all throughout her life, she continued to suffer these physical pains. Sometimes her body was so racked with pain that she couldn't leave her bed. But when she was able to do her work, she produced amazing work, whether it was musical compositions or botanical notes or visionary poetry. Eventually, she became the prioress, or the abbess, the leader of her convent, of her community. And she received a vision from God that says, I want you to move your convent down by the Rhine River. And she said, all right, Lord, I'll do this thing. And she went to her head, to the head of the monastery, because this time the convent was attached to the monastery, very patriarchal, and they couldn't do anything unless the priest approved it. The priest didn't approve it. But she knew it was from God, and she at first submitted to this priest, to this leader of the monastery, and this leader of her convent. And because she submitted, she began to feel this pain in her body, and she was unable to leave until finally she said, yes, Lord, I will press on, and I will persevere, and I will continue to enter into the promise that you have for me and those under my charge. So she went out of her lane, and she went over the priest's head. In fact, she went over the heads of many of the princes that then ruled Germany. It was princely states. And she wrote a letter to the Pope at the time. It was the year 1140 or so, a long time ago. And in the letter, she says, I would like to have an independent convent, separate from the monastery, and we want to move it to this location. Also, I would like to be able to begin to write down my revelations. Because until that point, she had not written any of her revelations down. She received the letter back from the Pope, and the Pope said, okay, you can do this. The priest was very upset. The priest says, why would you do this? Not only why would you go over my head, but why would you also leave this convent? It's made of brick and stone, and it's beautiful, and you won't have any of our support. And now you're going to be down by the river, and you're going to have to build your own home out of wood and mud and other such things. But she wasn't discouraged. And she went down to the Rhine, and all of these women, mighty women of God, fierce and faithful, followed Hildegard, and they built this kind of mud-thatched hut of sorts. And they lived there faithfully. They'd also taken a deeper vow of poverty at this time. some of the monks began to see what they were doing. And they kind of snuck out and they said, we'll help you. We'll help you build a better home and a better abode. And eventually they built an amazing convent that you can visit today on the Rhine. It's glorious and majestic. It was out of this suffering that allowed her to cultivate a deep sense of presence to the wonderment of the natural beauty and order of the world, as well as the supernatural experience of God's ever-presence in every moment. So this takes us back to the scriptures, back to Jesus. The passage that Deacon Mel read from Isaiah 53, the passage of the suffering servant. Jesus knew what it was to suffer. He did not want to suffer, and it was never God's plan for us to suffer. This is not God's plan. He does not want us to feel pain. She does not want us to have these broken parts of our life. But God works through the suffering in a redemptive and a restorative way. You have to be creative to bring restoration and redemption into the broken parts of this world. And we see that God is creative through and through the scriptures. The very first verse of the Bible in Genesis 1 says, in the beginning God created. God was creative and creating. And a few chapters later, we read that we are made in the image of God. Image is the root of imagination. So we are called to be creative and imaginative beings. And then when we see in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he writes, you are God's handiwork. But the real word for handiwork in the Koine Greek is more along the lines of poesia or poetry. You are God's poetry. This is what we're called to a life of creativity, a life of imagination and poetry, to participate in this new creation, to allow these new things to birth forth from us. And even though it wasn't God's plan for us to suffer, God uses that we might be healed, and that from our own personal wounds we might also allow healing into the lives of others. I want to close by reading the last passage of Rupi Kaur's first book of poetry, Milk and Honey. This is quite a collection of poetry. And it's a real challenge at the beginning because she shares so much of her brokenness and a lot of her trauma and the experiences that she had to live through, not only in India as a marginalized people, but then also migrating to Canada and a lot of abuse that she suffered in her own personal life. But as you go through this book, a lot of the beauty begins to manifest, and she uses the written word to redeem and confess and to share and to help heal others who engage with her word. In the very last part of her book, she writes, it's called A Love Letter from Me to You. You have made it to the end. With my heart in your hands, thank you for arriving here safely, for being tender with the most delicate part of me. Sit down, breathe. You must be tired. Let me kiss your hands, your eyes. They must be wanting of something sweet. I am sending you all my sugar. I would be nowhere and nothing if it were not for you. You've helped me become the person I wanted to be, but was too afraid to be. Do you have any idea how much of a miracle you are? How lovely it's been, and how lovely it will always always be. I am kneeling before you, saying thank you. I am sending my love to your eyes. May they always see goodness in people. And may you always practice kindness. May we see each other as one. May we be nothing short of in love with everything the universe has to offer. May we always stay grounded, rooted, our feet planted firmly onto the earth. This time I would like to invite you to join me in a circle.